The sun was setting behind the dusty plains when Eliza saw him. She'd walked for days, the soles of her feet worn thin and cracked, the baby in her arms fussy from hunger. The world around her seemed to grow darker with every step, the weight of her situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had no one left and no place to turn. Her husband, Samuel, had died in a ranching accident 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but a small daughter, Rose, and a broken heart. When her brother-in-law, Caleb, took the ranch from her, her home for years, he made it clear that she didn't belong anymore. No son, no legacy, just the land, his to claim, and a widow to cast out. Eliza's heart had shattered as Caleb looked at her with cold indifference, the door slamming behind her as she was sent out into the unforgiving prairie with no money, no food, and no shelter. The child in her arms didn't stop crying, but there was nothing she could do to calm her. She stumbled across the land, barefoot and exhausted, desperate for something to end the endless ache in her belly and the emptiness in her heart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza saw the silhouette of something massive in the distance, a ranch far grander than anything she had known. It stood like a fortress against the setting sky, its walls towering and thick, made of heavy logs that looked as if they had been dragged from the earth itself. The house seemed built for someone much larger than her. Her heart raced as she approached. She didn't know what she was hoping for, but she knew she couldn't keep walking. She knocked on the door, barely able to lift her hand, the baby's cries mingling with the last light of the day. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a giant of a man. Tall, broad, his figure cutting through the doorway like a shadow. Tobias was his name. "You need something?" His voice was deep, like the rumble of distant thunder, and his eyes seemed to look right through her, sizing her up. I need help," Eliza stammered. "Shelter, food, water. Please, I've nowhere else to go." He didn't say anything for a long moment, but his gaze softened just slightly. "Come in. I've got water and a bed for the night." As she stepped inside, she was struck by the enormity of the place. Everything was too big. The doors, the furniture, even the fireplace seemed to stretch into the sky. She felt small, almost like a child, but the warmth from the fire offered her a fleeting sense of comfort. Tobias was a man made from the land itself, muscles like rock, hands calloused from years of hard labor. He looked at her quietly as she sat by the fire, feeding the baby. His eyes flickered with something unreadable before he spoke again. "You're not the first woman to come through these doors asking for help." His tone was calm, measured, like a man used to being in control of everything. "But there's something you should know." Eliza looked up, her heart beating faster. She felt a strange chill crawl over her skin. "Listen to me, Eliza," Tobias said, taking a step forward, his shadow swallowing the firelight. "You can stay here, but first, you must hear what I need from you." Eliza's stomach twisted. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she knew there was a catch. There always was. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need?" Tobias paused, his gaze heavy, as if he were weighing something in his mind. Then his voice came low and steady. "Give me 4 sons," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "and I'll give you peace." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, impossible and strange. 4 sons? What did he mean by that? Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had just one daughter, a baby in her arms, and already the weight of motherhood felt like a heavy burden. She had no idea how she could possibly give him 4 sons. Tobias didn't explain further. Instead, he turned and walked to a corner of the room where there were large cradles, huge wooden cradles, all lined up and waiting for something to fill them. Eliza's eyes widened. It was like he had prepared for this moment, as if he had been waiting for a woman to come who would meet his impossible demand. "I want 4 sons to carry on my name," he said, his voice almost distant now. "I'll marry you, but only on the condition that you give me 4 sons. No more, no less. If you do this, I will give you everything you need. A place, food, protection. You'll be safe. Your daughter will have a home. His words echoed in her ears, but none of it made sense. He wanted 4 sons. It was a demand too strange to fully comprehend. Yet there was something desperate in his eyes. Something that told her he wasn't asking lightly. Eliza's mind spun. She glanced at her baby, still crying softly in her arms. Her heart broke for the life she had once dreamed of, a life with a husband who would protect her, a home that would be filled with laughter. Now, all she had was this impossible offer from a man who wanted sons she couldn't promise. But she had no other choice. The cold night pressed in on her as she sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking into her bones. "You have until sunrise to decide," Tobias said, his voice firm, unyielding. "4 sons, Eliza, or you leave with nothing." The door to her future had been opened, but the path ahead was uncertain. There was no turning back, no easy way out. And as Eliza looked down at her baby, she wondered if she could ever give Tobias what he wanted. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She had no other choice. What did 4 sons mean? Why did he need them so badly? And what would happen if she couldn't give them to him? The answers seemed impossible, but the clock was ticking, and Eliza had no time to waste. Eliza woke to the smell of fresh bread and the low murmur of a fire crackling in the hearth. The baby, Rose, had fallen asleep against her chest, her tiny breaths soft and steady. Tobias had been kind to her the night before, offering her warmth and food without hesitation. Yet, as the light filtered through the cabin's massive windows, Eliza couldn't shake the weight of Tobias's words from the night before. "Give me 4 sons, and I'll give you peace." The thought lingered in her mind like a heavy stone. What did it mean? And why sons? She had no idea how she could possibly fulfill such a demand. Still, her survival depended on her response. She couldn't afford to refuse him. She swallowed the knot in her throat and rose to find him. Tobias stood by the fire, his large hands working on a piece of wood, carving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The sight of him, huge, broad-shouldered, the muscles in his back rippling with every movement, was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. He looked up as she entered, his face unreadable, and nodded toward the table where breakfast had been laid out. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Eliza sat, the quiet tension between them palpable. As she picked at the food, Tobias broke the silence. "I'm not a man who shares his heart easily," he began, his voice low. "But you need to understand why I made the offer I did. It's not something I take lightly." He paused, his gaze distant. Eliza watched him, a knot tightening in her chest as she waited for him to continue. He sighed, the sound heavy. "I had a wife, Sarah," Tobias said, his eyes falling to the floor. "She died giving birth to our son, Samuel. I lost them both, her and the child, and I've been alone ever since. I've been building this ranch for years, working the land, but it feels empty. I thought if I had sons, they could help me run it, carry my name. My father had 4 sons. He was respected, feared, but me? People call me the giant. They look at me and see nothing but a lonely man. Women, children, none of them come near me. I've seen what happened to you, Eliza, and I've watched Caleb toss you out like you were nothing. But you're not nothing. I see that now, and that's why I made the offer to you." Eliza listened carefully, the weight of his words settling over her like a thick fog. She understood the pain in his voice, the emptiness he carried in his chest. He had suffered a loss so profound that it seemed to have shaped every part of him. His desire for sons, the loneliness he hid behind his strength, and the crumbling walls he had built around his heart. "But why sons?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with a question she hadn't dared ask before. Tobias looked at her, his expression pained. "A man with sons is a man who matters," he said. "Without them, I'm nothing but a ghost on this land. I need sons to prove to myself that I can be something. I need sons to carry on what I've built, to be the future of this place. And if you help me, I can offer you everything. You'll never want for anything again. You'll be safe here, cared for. You'll have food, shelter. No more worrying about what comes next. Eliza's heart twisted as she listened to his words. She understood his need, his desperate desire to be seen, to leave behind a legacy. But 4 sons, was that even possible? She thought of Rose, her small daughter, and the impossible weight of motherhood that already seemed too much to bear. What if she couldn't give him what he wanted? What if she failed him too? And what about Rose? Eliza asked, glancing down at her sleeping daughter. What happens to her if I agree to this? Tobias's gaze softened, his voice taking on a gentler tone. I'll adopt her as my own, he said, his eyes meeting hers. She'll be my daughter too. She deserves a future as much as anyone. And I'll make sure she's taken care of, just like my own flesh and blood. But I need 4 sons. I need a legacy, Eliza. I need something to prove that I'm not invisible, that my work on this land hasn't been for nothing. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, revealing the vulnerability he so carefully guarded. Eliza's mind raced. She had never expected anything like this. She hadn't come to Tobias for anything other than survival. But here she was, caught between the promise of safety and the impossible task of bearing 4 sons. She knew she couldn't control what happened in her body, but she also knew that turning down Tobias's offer meant facing a future of uncertainty, of wandering without a home. She looked down at Rose, her tiny hands curled into fists as she slept, and felt a surge of love for her daughter. Rose deserved a chance at a better life, and Tobias's offer was the only one that could give that to her. But could she live up to it? You don't have to decide right now, Tobias said, breaking her thoughts. But you have until sunrise tomorrow. 4 sons. That's the bargain. Eliza nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling into her bones. The bargain was set. She didn't know how she would fulfill it, but she knew one thing for certain. If she didn't take this chance, she and Rose would have nothing. Her heart heavy with the decision she had to make, Eliza looked at Tobias, her voice trembling as she asked, "And if I can't give you sons?" Tobias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, his massive frame towering over her, and looked out the window at the land he had worked so tirelessly to build. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "Then you'll leave, and I'll let you go, but you will leave with nothing. No home, no future." Eliza swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. The bargain was made, and she had to find a way to live up to it, or lose everything. The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land as Eliza stood in the small chapel, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the hem of her simple dress. Her heart beat erratically in her chest, the weight of the decision she had made settling in with each passing second. Tobias's proposal still felt like a dream, something too strange to truly comprehend. Yet there she was, about to marry a man she barely knew in exchange for a life she could only hope would be better than the one she had known. The preacher arrived with little more than a surprised look and a few murmured words, clearly not expecting the union between the giant and the barefoot woman. The townsfolk gossiped, casting sidelong glances as they whispered about Tobias's new bride, the woman who had agreed to be nothing more than a means to an end. Poor woman, they'd muttered, breeding stock for sons. The ceremony was short, impersonal, and when Tobias kissed her at the end, it was more of a formality than anything resembling affection. There was no love between them, just a transaction, a mutual agreement to fulfill an impossible bargain. Tobias was a man of few words, his actions speaking louder than any promises of love or tenderness. Eliza didn't expect anything else, not really. As the days passed, the house seemed to grow larger, more oppressive with every step she took. The furniture felt oversized, like she was a child playing in someone else's home. Tobias had built the place for someone much larger than her, someone who never needed to bend or reach for anything. The scale of everything reminded her of the strange world she had entered, one where everything was just out of her reach. Tobias worked long hours, barely speaking a word to her unless it was necessary. He was there in body, but his mind was elsewhere, always on the ranch, on the endless tasks he set for himself. He built her small step stools to reach the highest shelves, the only kindness he seemed to offer. They shared no meals together beyond the basics, their conversations terse and awkward. He came to her bed only when a need arose, fulfilling his part of the bargain without passion or affection. Eliza felt more like livestock than a wife, a means to an end, her only purpose to produce sons. The silence between them was suffocating. And yet, as much as she despised the arrangement, she found herself hoping for something more. She didn't want to be a mere tool for Tobias's legacy. She wanted to be seen, to be loved. But she knew better. She couldn't force something that wasn't there. Despite the coldness between them, there were moments when Eliza saw glimpses of the man Tobias could be. When Rose, now toddling around, crawled toward Tobias one afternoon, the sight of the child surprised him. At first, he looked awkward, unsure, as if he had forgotten how to hold a child. But then, slowly, he picked her up, cradling her in his large arms with surprising gentleness. For a brief moment, Eliza saw a crack in his armor. A soft smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was the first time he had truly interacted with Rose, and Eliza could almost believe that he had more to give than the harsh, demanding man she had married. But that moment was fleeting. As the days went by, the pressure of the bargain hung over them both. Eliza knew what was expected of her, and as time passed, she began to wonder whether she could ever meet that impossible demand. It was on one such night, after a quiet dinner, that Tobias's questions began. "Is it a son?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on her stomach. Eliza froze for a moment before nodding, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "It will be a son," she said, more to herself than to him. She hadn't realized how desperately she had clung to the hope of giving him what he wanted, of fulfilling her part of the bargain. The tension between them was palpable now. There was no turning back. She had promised Tobias what he needed, and if she failed, what would become of her, of Rose? The days that followed were filled with the same routine. Tobias working long hours, Eliza managing the house, each day blending into the next. When the time finally came, Eliza went into labor with a heavy heart. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she couldn't help but hope, just a little, that the child she bore would be the son Tobias so desperately wanted. The labor was long and painful, and Eliza's body cried out for rest. She nearly lost consciousness a few times, the world spinning in and out of focus. But she held on, driven by the thought of Tobias's approval, the promise of peace that had been dangled before her. When a midwife finally announced the arrival of the baby, Eliza's heart stopped. "It's a girl," the midwife said softly. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the room fell silent. Tobias's face went blank. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the baby. Eliza looked at the tiny girl in her arms. Lily, she named her, and felt a pang of guilt. Tobias hadn't even looked at her. He hadn't seen the child, hadn't acknowledged the gift that Eliza had given him. He hadn't seen her at all. When he returned later that night, drunk and distant, his voice was cold. "3 more chances," he said, his eyes unfocused, as though the sight of the baby girl had shattered something deep inside him. 3 more sons. Eliza lay there, numb, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She didn't know how to feel disappointment, anger, or fear. All she knew was that one chance was gone, and the pressure of the next would crush her if she let it. The promise of sons felt more impossible than ever. As Tobias lay in the other room, Eliza looked at the tiny form in her arms, wondering if she could ever meet the impossible demand he had set. Would she be able to give him a son, or would she be trapped forever in a world that never saw her for who she truly was. Months passed, each one blending into the next as Eliza's body endured the toll of pregnancy and childbirth, her hopes rising and falling with each new cycle. Tobias, once a looming figure in the distance, now seemed a ghost in his own home, quiet, detached, and distant. The four cradles stood empty, like silent monuments to a promise that had not been kept, and Eliza could feel the weight of their emptiness pressing down on her. Lily, their first daughter, was now walking and talking, and her innocence and curiosity filled the house with a lightness that Tobias could never seem to match. Yet, as the seasons changed, so too did the tension between them, a slow burn that neither of them could extinguish. When Eliza discovered she was pregnant again, she felt a mixture of dread and hope. Could this be the one? The child that would give Tobias the son he wanted so badly? She didn't know how much more she could take of the weight of his expectations, but her love for Rose and Lily kept her moving forward, determined to fulfill the bargain, to make the impossible possible. Tobias barely reacted when she told him. His eyes flickered with something between disappointment and resignation. It was as if he had already prepared himself for the worst, and Eliza felt her heart tighten. When the day came and Eliza went into labor, the house was quieter than usual. Tobias worked, as he always did, from dawn till dusk, his hands never still. The hours dragged on as Eliza's body struggled with another painful birth, and when the midwife finally announced the arrival of another girl, this one named Iris, Eliza felt something inside of her break. Tobias barely reacted at all. He walked out of the room without even looking at the baby, his footsteps heavy, his mood darker than ever. The coldness between them seemed to deepen, and Eliza wondered if he would ever see her as anything more than a failure. The cradles, those giant wooden structures meant to hold sons, remained untouched, and the weight of Tobias's unspoken expectations loomed over her like a thundercloud. With every passing day, the distance between them grew. He no longer seemed to notice her at all, except when it came to fulfilling his bargain. His eyes grew colder with each failed attempt, and Eliza could see how the bitterness and disappointment twisted inside him, how it slowly consumed him. He no longer worked with the same energy, no longer took care in his tasks. It was as if each failed pregnancy had chipped away at the very foundation of who he was. Eliza, too, began to feel the weight of those expectations. She spent her days taking care of Lily and Rose, and Iris, her new daughter, who was now only a few months old. The house, once so large and intimidating, now felt suffocating, and she longed for the days when it had just been her and her husband, before all the promises and demands had entered their lives. But she couldn't go back. There was no escape from the cradles, from the empty rooms that would forever be waiting for something they could never hold. The town, too, had begun to gossip. The rumors started in the market, in hushed voices and sideways glances. The giant wanted sons, but all he got was a garden of flowers, they said. He tried 4 times and failed. Eliza could hear their cruel words, and it hurt, but she didn't dare let it show. She defended Tobias, even as she felt the sting of their laughter deep in her chest. She could never admit the truth, not even to herself, not fully. The shame of it all was too much. She began to see Tobias not as the man who had offered her shelter, but as the man who demanded too much of her. She longed for the days when he had looked at her with kindness, when she had felt something more than obligation between them. But those days seemed far behind her now. She felt trapped, caught in a cycle of failure that she couldn't escape. But even as the bitterness grew, even as the cradles remained empty and the house grew colder, there were moments when Eliza saw something more in Tobias. He still watched the girls when they played, though he never joined them. His eyes followed them when they ran around the yard, their laughter echoing in the distance. Eliza noticed that he would sometimes leave wildflowers on the table, the kind he used to bring Sarah when they were young. He'd fix broken toys in silence, his large hands working with surprising tenderness. There was a part of him that still cared, a part of him that was broken, and Eliza saw it, even if he refused to admit it. One night, after a long day, Eliza confronted him. She had had enough of the silence, of the distance that stretched between them like an impassable desert. "You love them, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. Tobias looked at her, his face unreadable, and then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "They aren't what I needed," he said, his words heavy with regret. Eliza felt the ache in his words, but she didn't back down. "They're what you have," she said firmly. "And they're perfect. They're more than enough." Tobias walked away then, his shoulders stiff, the burden of his expectations heavier than ever. But Eliza wasn't going to wait for him to change. She couldn't. She had made a promise, and she would keep it, whether Tobias ever came around or not. But when she found out she was pregnant again, her heart twisted in fear. Would this be the son he demanded, or the daughter that would be another blow to their already broken marriage? As the days passed and the tension mounted, Eliza wondered if the bargain was worth it, if the cost of trying to meet Tobias's impossible expectations had already been too high. And yet, with each new life she carried, each new daughter born, her love for them grew stronger, even as she feared the future that loomed ahead. The question now wasn't whether she could give Tobias what he wanted, but whether they could ever truly find peace in the life they had made. The day Eliza went into labor again, she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. For pregnancies, 4 failures, each one a crushing disappointment for Tobias, each one leaving her feeling more like a vessel than a woman. She had already borne him 3 daughters, none of the sons he demanded, and now she found herself pregnant once more, with no hope of fulfilling his expectations. Rose, now 6, and Lily, for were old enough to understand the tension that filled the house, and they no longer asked where their father went when he disappeared into his work or why he never played with them. Iris, at 3, and Violet, just a newborn, hadn't yet grasped the weight of their family's unspoken grief, but they would soon enough. As Eliza labored, she felt a strange numbness take over, the pain of the contractions becoming something she could no longer feel. She had shut down, her heart wrapped in layers of cold, protective armor. It was a defense mechanism she had built for herself to survive the relentless pressure of Tobias's impossible demands. The midwife had come again, and as the hours dragged on, Eliza's mind wandered back to the first time she had come to this ranch, desperate for a chance at survival. She had been so full of hope then, so willing to believe that Tobias's offer could somehow give her a new life, a better future. But now, the weight of that promise felt unbearable, like a noose tightening around her neck. Tobias had been different then. He had been gentle with her, kind even, and though he had made his demands clear from the start, she had thought they were just that, demands. She hadn't known how deeply he was tied to the idea of having sons, of building a legacy, of proving to himself and the world that he mattered. But the years had worn away at that hope, leaving her with only frustration and fear. As the midwife delivered the child, Eliza heard the soft cry of a baby, a cry that should have filled her with joy, but instead only deepened the sense of loss that clung to her heart. Tobias had stayed away, as he always did, his presence nowhere to be found. It was the same pattern, the same coldness that had followed them since the first birth. He hadn't looked at any of their daughters with the same pride he had once promised. He hadn't even looked at her. Another girl, the midwife said quietly, and Eliza's chest tightened with an ache she couldn't quite explain. She had hoped, no, she had prayed, for a son, but it wasn't meant to be. This 4th daughter, Magnolia, named for the flowers that bloomed wild around the ranch, was another girl. Another failure in Tobias's eyes. She held the baby close to her chest, feeling the weight of her tiny body, her warm breath on Eliza's skin. And despite everything, despite the heartbreak and the crushing weight of Tobias's unfulfilled expectations, Eliza knew that this child was no failure. This child was perfect, but Tobias wouldn't see that. He had never seen it. He never would. When Tobias finally entered the room, his eyes were dark, clouded with something between anger and sorrow. He didn't look at the baby, didn't acknowledge her presence. He didn't even look at Eliza. Instead, he turned and walked out, his footsteps heavy, echoing in the silence of the room. The door slammed behind him, and Eliza knew, deep in her bones, that this was the breaking point. She had tried. She had given everything she could give, but it was never enough. She was never enough. Over the next few days, Tobias retreated further into himself, locking himself away in the barn, drowning his sorrow in drink. The ranch hands whispered behind her back, worried about the state of the ranch and its master. The town, too, began to gossip openly. The giant wanted sons, they said, but all he's got are daughters. 4 chances, 4 failures. Eliza heard their whispers, their cruel words, but she refused to let them break her. She had her daughters. They were hers, and no matter what Tobias thought, they were enough. She had given them everything she could. But now, there was something new growing inside of her. Something fiercer than the love she felt for her daughters. Something more powerful than the shame she had carried for so long. It was anger. Anger at Tobias for making her feel like she was nothing but a means to an end. Anger at herself for believing that he could ever be the man she had hoped he would be. Her daughters deserved better. She deserved better. When Caleb arrived, his presence was like a dark cloud hanging over the ranch. He came with papers, legal documents claiming that the debts from her late husband had never been paid off, and now, with no sons to carry on the legacy, he was entitled to everything: her land, her daughters. "They're mine," he said coldly. "They're my blood, and they'll be raised to serve me. I'll marry them off for profit." His words sent a shiver down Eliza's spine. He had always been cruel, but now his threat was more real than ever. He was coming for her daughters, and she couldn't let him have them. She couldn't let him tear her family apart. The confrontation that followed was swift. Caleb grabbed Eliza's arm, his fingers digging into her skin as he tried to drag her outside, his voice rising with threats. The girls were playing in the yard, oblivious to the danger, but Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't let him take them. She couldn't let him destroy everything she had fought for. In a moment of desperation, Eliza screamed for help, her voice piercing the stillness of the ranch. And then, like thunder, the ground shook with the footsteps of Tobias coming home. The giant was returning, and he was about to reclaim what was his. The earth trembled beneath Caleb's feet as Tobias stormed across the yard, his massive form emerging from the barn like a force of nature, each step shaking the ground as though the very earth was responding to his fury. Eliza barely had time to take in a breath before Tobias reached her, his eyes blazing with a heat Eliza had never seen before. Caleb, his hands still gripping her arm tightly, looked up at the giant, his face draining of color as Tobias's shadow loomed over him. "Those are my daughters," Tobias thundered, his voice so deep it reverberated through the ground. Caleb's hand loosened from Eliza's arm as Tobias seized him by the throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground, his grip like a vice. The air crackled with raw power as Tobias's chest heaved with each angry breath. His face a storm of emotions. Fear, anger, protectiveness, all swirled together in a way Eliza had never witnessed. Tobias was no longer the man who had hidden behind his expectations, the one who believed his worth was defined by the sons he could not have. In that moment, he was a father, one who would fight for his daughters with everything he had. Caleb's feet dangled in the air as he gasped for breath, his eyes wide with terror. Tobias held him aloft, his voice a low growl. "You will never touch them. You will never lay a hand on my family." With a sudden, powerful motion, Tobias threw Caleb to the ground with a force that made the earth seem to tremble again. Caleb scrambled to his feet, but Tobias was already there, stepping toward him with the weight of a mountain. "You touched them again," Tobias said in a voice that could have frozen the air itself, "and I'll bury you where no one will find you." Caleb, pale and shaken, didn't say another word. He turned and fled, bolting for his horse without looking back. Tobias watched him go, his chest still heaving as his eyes never left Caleb's retreating form. Eliza, her heart still racing, stood frozen in place, watching the man she had married transform before her very eyes. For the first time since they had met, she saw the raw power of the man she had hoped he could be. Tobias had not only saved her daughters from Caleb's cruel grasp, but had also claimed them as his own in a way that no words could ever express. For the first time in years, Eliza felt the weight of the impossible bargain lift just a little. Tobias had always been the giant, towering and powerful, but now, in this moment, he was something else. He was their protector, their father, and for Eliza, he was no longer the man she feared would never see her or their daughters for who they were. As Tobias collapsed onto the porch steps, his shoulders sagged under the weight of the emotions that had finally come pouring out. Eliza walked over to him slowly, her feet light, her breath shallow as she approached. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, raw, and in desperate need of something he had never allowed himself to have. Tobias didn't look at her as she sat beside him, but she could see the exhaustion on his face, the weariness in his eyes that went beyond physical fatigue. He had carried so much inside for so long, pain, regret, loneliness, that it had all come to a head in this moment. She wanted to reach out, to say something that would make it better, but there were no words to fix the years of brokenness between them. Instead, she sat beside him, offering the only comfort she could give. After a long, aching silence, Tobias spoke, his voice raw and unsteady. "I wanted 4 sons because I thought that would make me matter," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "My father had sons. He was respected, feared. I thought if I had sons, I would be something, someone. But all this time, I've been a fool. I've been blind." His eyes drifted toward the house, where their daughters played in the yard, their laughter ringing out like music in the warm afternoon air. "I wanted sons to carry on my name, to run this ranch. But I see now that it's them, my daughters, who will carry me. They're my legacy. They're my future. I don't need sons to know what's mine." Eliza's heart ached as she listened to his words. She had always known there was more to Tobias than the stubborn, distant man he had been. But now he was finally opening up, finally seeing what she had seen all along. She had never needed him to be someone he wasn't. All she had ever wanted was for him to see what he had in front of him, his daughters, his family. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm, feeling the roughness of his skin, the heat of his body. "They've always been yours," she said softly, her voice steady but full of love. "You just wouldn't see it. And so have I." Tobias's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of his pride and his fears seemed to disappear. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Any of you." Eliza shook her head, her hand gently squeezing his arm. "Yes, you do," she said firmly. "You just need to believe it." He stared at her for a long moment, as if searching her face for something he had never been able to find. And then, finally, he spoke the words that Eliza had waited years to hear. "Give me another chance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not to have sons, to be a father to these daughters, to be a husband to the woman who gave me everything." Her heart swelled with a love so deep it threatened to overwhelm her. "You already are," she whispered, her voice full of warmth. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps approached, and Rose, the oldest, came running toward them, her small face bright with curiosity. "Papa," she asked tentatively, her voice a soft question. Tobias's breath hitched in his chest as he looked down at his daughter, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He reached out, pulling her into his arms with a tenderness that surprised them both. "Yes, little one," he said, his voice shaking as he held her close. "I'm here." As Rose rested her head against his chest, Eliza watched, her heart filling with joy as their family finally came together. The giant who had once demanded 4 sons had finally become a father to his daughters. The transformation was complete, and Eliza knew their story was just beginning. 3 years passed since the day Tobias had claimed his daughters as his own, and the transformation that had taken place in their family was nothing short of remarkable. The ranch had blossomed under Tobias's guidance, but it wasn't just the land that had flourished. It was the bond between him, Eliza, and their daughters that had truly thrived. The once silent, imposing giant who had sought to prove his worth through the sons he never had was now a father in every sense of the word, and a husband who cherished his wife as she deserved to be cherished. Each day, Tobias could be found teaching his daughters the ways of the ranch, showing them the skills that had once been reserved for sons. Rose, now 9 years old, had become a sharp-minded young woman, overseeing the ranch's books with an impressive grasp of numbers and details. She was Tobias's right hand in managing the ranch's affairs, making sure every account was balanced and every deal was made with precision. She had inherited his drive and ambition, and he was proud of the woman she was becoming. Lily, 7, was a natural with horses. Tobias had taught her how to train and care for the animals, and she had a way with them that amazed him. It was as though she could speak to them without words, coaxing even the wildest creatures into submission with a gentle hand and a steady voice. Iris, 6, had become fearless in her own right. She spent her days handling the cattle with Tobias, never afraid to step up and take charge, much like him. She had his strength, his determination, and his keen eye for what needed to be done. Violet, 5, had inherited Eliza's nurturing spirit. She could often be found in the garden, tending to the flowers and vegetables with a quiet patience that made Eliza's heart swell with pride. She had a keen understanding of the land, knowing how to coax the earth into producing the crops they needed to feed the ranch and the town. Little Maggie, only 3, followed her sisters around, eager to learn and take part in whatever they were doing. Tobias had made sure to encourage each of his daughters, letting them find their passions while supporting them in every way he could. No longer was the ranch a place built on the need for sons. It was a place of opportunity and growth, not just for the land, but for his daughters to make their mark in the world. The cradles that had once been empty were no longer the symbols of loss, but rather of the love that had filled Tobias's heart in a way he had never imagined. The 4 rooms that had been reserved for sons were now filled with life, laughter, and purpose. One room had been transformed into a library, where Rose spent hours reading books and managing the accounts for the ranch. Another had become an art studio, filled with paintings and drawings that Lily had created. The music room was where Iris spent her time learning to play the piano, her music filling the house with the melodies of her heart. The last room was now a workshop where Tobias and his daughters spent hours building and fixing things, creating not only practical tools for the ranch, but also items that brought them joy and fulfillment. Eliza had repurposed the once empty spaces into areas where her daughters could express themselves fully, and Tobias had been delighted to see their creativity and individuality flourish. The ranch was thriving, not just in terms of success, but in the way it had become a true home, one that radiated warmth, love, and the kind of peace Eliza had never thought possible. The community that had once mocked Tobias now came to him for advice, seeking to learn from the way he had raised his daughters to be strong, capable women. Other ranchers, who had once whispered about the giant and his failure, now looked at his daughters with respect and admiration. Word had spread about the giant's daughter's ranch, and many had begun to see the value in empowering women to run the land, to take charge of their own futures. Tobias had become a respected figure not just because of his strength, but because of the way he had allowed his daughters to carve their own paths, teaching them that their worth was not defined by their gender or their ability to produce sons. Eliza, too, had undergone a transformation. No longer barefoot and desperate, she had become a confident, strong woman who was respected and loved by those around her. She had built a family, a life, and a ranch that was truly her own. The once timid, unsure woman who had walked barefoot across the prairie was now a beloved wife, a mother who had raised daughters who would leave their own legacies in the world. She had learned, over the years, that peace wasn't something that could be demanded or controlled. It was something that had to be earned, built, and nurtured. And she had done that with Tobias by her side. As the evening sun dipped low over the prairie, casting a golden light over the ranch, Eliza sat on the porch, her heart full as she watched her daughters play in the yard. Tobias sat beside her, his large hand resting gently on her pregnant belly. It had been 3 years since that fateful day when Tobias had demanded 4 sons, and now she found herself expecting again. There was no fear in her heart this time, no anxiety over whether she would meet Tobias's expectations. She had long since realized that what they had built together was far more than a transaction. It was love, pure and simple. She looked at Tobias, and for the first time in years, he wasn't the giant who had demanded sons. He was the man who had become a father to their daughters, who had learned to love them for who they were, not for what they could be. "What if it's another girl?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a touch of humor. She placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his touch. Tobias smiled, a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and softened the lines of his face. "Then we'll need to build a 6th room," he said, his voice light, filled with affection. Eliza chuckled, feeling the weight of all her fears and doubts slip away. "But you wanted 4 sons. You said," Tobias interrupted her gently, his thumb caressing her hand. "I was a fool," he said, his voice sincere, filled with the wisdom of someone who had learned through pain and regret. "I wanted 4 sons because I thought that would make me someone. But you gave me 4 daughters, and they gave me everything." He looked out at the yard, where Rose, Lily, Iris, Violet, and little Maggie were playing, their laughter ringing through the air like music. "Whatever this child is, they'll be loved," Tobias said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the only bargain that ever mattered." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the peace that had eluded them for so long settle into her heart. She knew that no matter what the future held, they had found what they had been searching for all along: a family, a life built on love and understanding. The ranch had become a place of warmth and safety, a place where dreams were nurtured and where each of them, Tobias included, had finally found their place in the world. As the camera pulled back, the sight of Tobias surrounded by his wife and daughters, all laughing together in the fading light, was one of peace, a peace that had come not from getting what they had demanded, but from learning to love what they had been given. The 4 cradles, once symbols of failure, had been repurposed with love and care. Rose's cradle became a keepsake chest, Lily's a reading nook, Iris's a treasure box, and Maggie's a doll bed. The promise of sons had been replaced by something far greater, a family forged through struggle, but united in love. Eliza's voice, soft and full of warmth, was heard in the background. Sometimes the greatest blessings come in unexpected forms. And as the sun set over the prairie, casting its golden glow over their family, the story of the giant and his barefoot wife was complete. They had found peace, not by holding on to what they thought they wanted, but by embracing the unexpected gifts life had given them. They had built something that would endure together,